Now that the Resident Evil 4 remake is out, we now have had every single classic Resident Evil game remade. And with the exception of RE3, every single remake has been received quite positively by the casual and hardcore fans alike. However, it seems that this era of Resident Evil remakes is coming to an end, as Capcom is sort of running out of games to remake. Although, there is one classic Resident Evil game that fans will not let be forgotten: Resident Evil Code Veronica. Now, depending on who's watching this video, you might be thinking, oh yeah, Code Veronica, that game is awesome. Or you could be thinking, Code who? Code Veronica is considered by many Resident Evil fans as being that overlooked and underappreciated game that never seemed to get a proper chance. It first launched on the Dreamcast, which was not exactly the most successful console, although it does have its fans, and later released as Code Veronica X on the PS2 and GameCube. There's even an HD version on newer consoles, but despite this, it still doesn't seem like Code Veronica gets the recognition it deserves, which has left many fans, including myself, absolutely dying to see a remake of this game, especially since most Resident Evil remakes have been really good. But let's not forget that games these days take a lot of time, talent, and most importantly, money to make. And Capcom isn't going to dump all these resources into a project if they don't think the outcome will be profitable. Games like an RE2 remake and an RE4 remake are pretty obvious slam dunks for Capcom, as the original games were extremely well regarded and successful. So rather than discussing if Code Veronica will get a remake, I'd rather discuss if Code Veronica should get a remake. Now, of course, if you ask any Resident Evil fan, the obvious answer is going to be yes. But let's try to look at this from a non-biased perspective, okay? What does Code Veronica do differently than the other games? What about the story, the characters, the gameplay? And does Code Veronica stand toe-to-toe with the PlayStation classics? Or is there a reason people tend to forget this one? Well, let's begin with the story. I've said in a previous video that I don't believe Resident Evil games have very deep or complex stories, nor do they need to. However, Code Veronica is the exception to this, which leads me to say that this is the best story out of any Resident Evil game in the franchise. And I know that's debatable, but it at least deserves to be in the conversation. So with that said, let's go over the plot. Code Veronica begins with this text scrawl that recaps the events of the Raccoon City outbreak.
Claire Redfield, who arrived in Raccoon City to search for her lost brother Chris.
What?
Police officer.
Then we get an absolutely ridiculous cutscene of Claire Redfield breaking into an Umbrella laboratory to search for her brother Chris. Seriously, Chris, could you not send her a letter or something? How long has Claire been looking for you at this point? Anyways, this scene introduces us to our protagonist, Claire Redfield, who is my personal favorite Resident Evil protagonist, and let me tell you why. Out of all Resident Evil protagonists, Claire is the only one who just feels like a normal person. She's not an elite member of STARS like Jill and Chris. She's not a badass government agent like Leon Kennedy. She's the only character I can think of that gets this average Joe type of portrayal, although she is capable of kicking some ass when push comes to shove. Before we get back to the story, let's talk about this opening a bit more, because holy moly is this some over-the-top goofy shit. Now, I am totally okay with goofy over-the-top action in Resident Evil, as long as it remains in the cutscenes and doesn't affect the actual gameplay like it does with the island in RE4. In fact, I welcome the goofy over-the-top action. Just keep it out of the gameplay, for God's sakes. Keep the gameplay survival horror. Back to the story. Claire gets captured by Umbrella and sent to this military island that's under Umbrella authority. She wakes up in a prison cell to the sound of some commotion outside. Then one of the prison guards enters the room and lets Claire out of her cell, declaring that the prison is finished. Claire leaves the prison only to be greeted by some zombies coming out of the ground. God damn, I love this scene. It reminds me of the movie Return of the Living Dead, which is an awesome zombie movie from the 80s. Claire escapes from the zombies and meets Steve.
Relax, beautiful.
Yeah, Claire, you might have been better off with the zombies. Steve fucking sucks. But we'll talk about Steve later. Moving forward, Claire comes across a palace and encounters Alfred Ashford. This introductory scene to Alfred Ashford is one of my favorite scenes in the entire Resident Evil franchise. Alfred comes off as this comically over-the-top supervillain-esque character.
I am Alfred Ashford, commander of this base.
Oh? You must be one of Umbrella's lower level officers if you're in command of a backwater base like this one.
How dare you!
Which is a great way to introduce him, because later on we find out that he's actually pretty twisted in the head. This leads me to one of the main reasons why I think Code Veronica's story stands out among the rest. This game is fucking dark. The Ashford family is a group of some really fucked up individuals. We also learn that the Ashfords are some of the founding members of Umbrella, giving us some insight into just how corrupt and evil Umbrella really is, which leads me to my next reason why Code Veronica stands out. That is, the contributions to the lore of Umbrella. In the PlayStation games, we always knew Umbrella were the ones fucking shit up, but we didn't really know much about the Umbrella Corporation itself. Code Veronica is the first game to really dive into how this organization came to be, and if Capcom was to remake Code Veronica, they could take this a step forward, give us even more lore about Umbrella, even more information on the Ashford family. Back to the story though. After encountering Alfred, things start to slow down. You have some puzzles to solve, some zombies and monsters to deal with. It's classic Resident Evil goodness. I don't think it's necessary for me to go over every event in detail in the story, but there's two characters I'd like to talk about before we move on, with the first being Albert motherfucking Wesker. I think it goes without saying that Wesker is one of the coolest goddamn characters in the Resident Evil franchise. Best villain in the franchise for sure. Code Veronica gives us some of the best Wesker action of any of the games.
What went on between you two, but you have him all wrong. My brother is not the kind of person you think he is.
I despise Chris.
And the fact that they showed Wesker at the end of RE4 Remake just makes me crave a Code Veronica even more. It seems like they're setting it up for a Code Veronica remake, because that game is very Albert Wesker focused. And let's be honest, Resident Evil has had a severe lack of Albert Wesker in the recent years. The next character I'd like to talk about is Steve.
Shut up! I don't want to talk about it!
If there was a reason to not remake Code Veronica, it would be Steve.
Father!
Listen, I'm all for corny voice acting in Resident Evil. However, Code Veronica is the first Resident Evil game to actually have some decent voice acting. It's certainly not Metal Gear Solid levels of voice acting, no, far from it, but it's a huge step up from the PlayStation games. And with the darker tone and more serious nature of Code Veronica's story overall, a character like Steve sticks out like a sore thumb.
Okay, let's do it! Wait here, Claire. Time to test out my new toy.
Especially when you consider the fact that removing Steve from the story wouldn't really change anything. Steve is a bumbling buffoon every time he's on screen. At one point, he accidentally leaks toxic gas into the room because he's too busy checking out Claire's ass. Fuck this guy. If they ever do a Code Veronica remake, I say kick Steve to the curb. We don't need him. There's no reason for him to be in this story. In fact, the story would be much better without him in the picture.
No!
So before we talk about the gameplay, level design, and all that good stuff, I want to take a minute to talk about some of the aspects of Code Veronica that go unnoticed, but also add a lot to the experience. The first of these being the music, and god damn it, this game might have my favorite soundtrack out of any Resident Evil game, and that's saying a lot too, because these games have some pretty killer soundtracks. The palace music is creepy and ominous. And once you get further into the palace, the music becomes even more foreboding and creepy. Then there's this safe room music. Fucking beautiful. The music combined with the aesthetics of the level design create a very unique atmosphere. The palace has this Transylvanian-like design. You know, the bats are there, very Dracula's castle-esque, which contrasts very well with the industrial aesthetic of the military base. Then you got the Umbrella facility in Antarctica, where not only do you need to worry about the horrifying monsters, but it's also cold outside? God damn, if that doesn't get your knees knocking, then I don't know what will. But seriously, having that creepy horror atmosphere is so important for these games, and I think Code Veronica does a really good job in that regard. Now let's talk about the gameplay in Code Veronica, and if I'm being honest, this is probably the most underwhelming thing about the game. Not that the gameplay is bad or anything, it's the same Resident Evil gameplay from the PlayStation games, but the reason why I say it's underwhelming is because it really doesn't do anything new. Let me explain. Both RE2 and RE3 had gameplay mechanics that were unique to those games. RE2 had the zapping system, and RE3 had those moments where you were given the choice of two paths. Code Veronica doesn't really have anything like this. I suppose you could say the lighter is a bit more useful since it makes the bats leave you alone. You could also trade the lighter for a lockpick as Claire, and later on when you switch to Chris, you can get that same lighter by defeating the worm. These are interesting mechanics, but they don't strike me as defining gameplay mechanics like the zapping system is for RE2. But other than that, this is classic Resident Evil gameplay at its best. The level design is just as great as the previous games. In fact, there's a little bit of extra effort here to make going from one place to another more interesting, like getting into a submarine or an elevator that can take you to 3 separate floors. Things like that are really appreciated because running from room to room and watching door opening animations one after another can get tedious. And now it's time to talk about the boss fights. Holy shit. If there was one reason I could give for why Code Veronica should get a remake, it's the motherfucking boss fights. Christ on a cracker, does this game have some good boss fights. You got the worm, the albinoid, the giant spider, the Alexia fight, the fucking Nosferatu fight. God damn, that one is awesome. You get to fight Tyrant on a jet plane in this game. The lineup here is just insane. And yeah, I know things like the giant spider and the worm are optional fights, but come on, just imagine seeing these bosses in the RE engine. I'm hyping myself up just talking about it. Not only are the bosses in this game great, but the enemy design in general is phenomenal. Code Veronica really leans into the insect-based monsters. There's spiders, moths, of course there's the worm. When the albinoids first break out, they're like these little insect larvas. Alexia herself is like the queen ant of all the monsters. Some of the key items themselves are insects, like the dragonfly and the ants. If you really think about it, the insect-based monsters are the only monsters that haven't been properly adapted in modern Resident Evil. For example, OG Resident Evil 2 had those big fuzzy spiders in the sewers, but in the remake they're nowhere to be seen. I feel like a remake of Code Veronica would be such a unique game in that sense, since the insect monsters were always the ones that creeped me out the most. So yeah, I think by this point everybody knows where I stand when it comes to a potential Code Veronica remake. I absolutely think this game should get a remake, because it could very well end up being the best Resident Evil game ever made. And, you know, obviously I can imagine the best Resident Evil game ever made in my head. It's another thing to actually make it, but, you know, the potential is there, is all I'm saying. As long as they did it right. That brings us to the end of the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this discussion, and hopefully Capcom is willing to take a chance on a Code Veronica remake, but I guess only time will tell. If you enjoyed this video at any point, then leave a like. I have loads of ideas for Resident Evil content in the future that I am constantly working on, so if that's something you think you would enjoy, then consider subscribing to this channel. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Have a good one.
Family, I will kill you. Wait!
What's going on?
Steve! Look at the door!
After her!